Coming up today on The Story.
I said, Mum, I need some talent. I need some singers. And so Mum said to me, look, I've just come back from Canberra. There was a guy that was busking there at the conference. He was like just singing and playing his guitar. He actually wasn't too bad. Let's try to find him and maybe bring him down. His name's Steve Grace.
The Story.
G'day, I'm Jimmy Colefax. Welcome to The Story. Well, today we have part 2 of our conversation with Phil Fusco. He's sharing his life journey and how the Lord has led him on many adventures, including overseas in the secular marketplace, as well as in ministry right here in Australia. Last time we heard that Phil comes from a long line of business people and also has a ministry heritage. Today we'll pick up the story as Phil is in his early 20s and is organising an Easter event at the local shopping centre that he was asked to organise by his pastor. This is when he first came in contact with a relatively unknown Christian singer at the time named Steve Grace. Now, here's more of Phil's conversation with Eric Scatterbo.
And I said, Mum, I need some talent. I need some singers. And so Mum said to me, look, I've just come back from Canberra at what was called the National Alliance of Christian Leaders, NACL. Mm-hmm. And she came back and said, look, Phil, there was a guy that was busking there at the NACL conference. He was like just singing and playing his guitar. He actually wasn't too bad. Why don't you, let's try to find him and maybe bring him down. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay. So I said, well, what's his name, Mum? She said, his name's Steve Grace.
Oh, okay.
And I said, okay, well, I'm looking for a young person and I'm looking for an older person for the older audiences. Mm-hmm. And so we found this guy called Steve Grace, and he was a young guy, probably about 25, 26, something like that, long blonde hair, chiseled sort of face. So he had the look, had the heart, and he had these really interesting songs. He just recorded on a cassette. Cost him $2,000, he told me, this little cassette which was called Young Australian Man. And he just wrote this song called Young Australian Man and Land of the Rock. And so that was Steve. And I didn't know who he was, but he was going to be my young, youthful act. And then Mum introduced me to another guy called John McDonald. I think I'm pronouncing McDonald right. And he was a wonderful man from Geelong who had this very deep, rich, old school crooner sort of voice.
Yep.
And I thought, well, this guy's got talent too. And I said, so he was our older audience sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is it. So we put this program together. I emceed it, of course. You know what I mean? Who else can pull this together? I need to MC it.
Yeah.
Anyway, when Steve was on stage, and this is the transition now, so I'll just put this together for you. So this is like, when Steve was on stage, something happened with his music. People literally down the mall of Doncaster Shopping Town, if anyone knows the mall, it's got these long malls.
I've been there. Mm-hmm.
People were just being drawn to the centre stage in front of Myers when Steve was singing. And his music resonated. He did something. And so... So it was all done. Everything was done and finished. Steve was staying at our house, like as people do. These people in ministry just sort of go from house to house staying with people, and it's a faith walk. And Steve was staying with us at our house. And so I began to talk to Steve and said, "Look, Steve, I'm young. I'm only 23, what it was, 22." And I said, "Look, I had this thing over me." I said, "Steve, I said, what are you doing with your life, Steve?" All of a sudden I started talking to this guy. I said, "Steve, what are you doing with your life?" Because he told me he was married, he had a young child, but he's telling me that he's living by faith. And I felt kind of like a little bit disturbed by this. And I said, "Steve," is anybody managing you? You know what I mean? Where are you going with your life?
So is he kind of the typical creative type who's very creative but not very practical?
Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose that, their head's in that creative space. Yeah. And his wife, Kerry, in essence, was managing him. Oh, okay. And probably Kerry's father, Ross, was probably advising him as well. So it was kind of like a family thing. Yeah. And so even me making my sort of audacious proposal, it was a step of faith for me. And it was a step of faith for Steve to consider it. And he rang Kerry, and basically they said, "Phil, we'd like you to manage me." Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I did. And so I did my very first, and I just studied marketing at night school, and I did my very first marketing plan on Steve Grace. Trying to put all this theory into some sort of practical product.
Yeah, how did it go?
Well, I mean, the thing is this, again, me, because I like excellence, just like I went to centre management to take centre stage, I went straight to Word Records. I arranged to meet a guy called Stan Moulton, who was the managing director of Word Records, and basically discussed Steve Grace and doing an album together. And Stan said to me, Phil, he literally said to me, Phil, a lot of artists come to us wanting us to get behind them. He says, we've decided we're going to back Steve Grace. And he said, one of the reasons is the fact is that you're managing him. He says, we, from a business point of view in the ministry, know that unless an artist tours and has the discipline to tour, we won't be able to sell tickets and sell merchandise to run our ministry in that sort of sense. And so there was a practical side to running a ministry. I suppose Paul had his tents. He was making tents to underwrite his ministry.
Yep.
So this is a ministry, unless you earn some money, you know what I mean? You can't pay the bills, you can't pay salary. So there's a practical side. So they said, we feel that you'll be able to manage Steve. Not to say that Steve was unmanageable, but it was a principle that I think they'd been burnt with other artists.
Okay.
And so I think it gave them courage that I was a local boy. I seemed to look like they could trust me. I spoke, with forked tongue, like I spoke, with sincerity, whatever. And so they said, we're going to create a new label called Triune, which will be basically Word's first Australian label to launch just Australian Christian product, and Steve's album will be the first one. So that all came together. And before I dwell on that project, the lesson that I picked up just for those sort of following the journey is I really believe the Lord led me to Steve because I learnt the first step of humbling myself to serve the church and the youth group to do that Easter concert. And it became very loud and clear to me the Lord trusted me with doing that and then said, okay, Phil, now I take you to the next step. You know what I mean? And that's what happened. And so with Steve, as those that know the story, I mean, the album was called Children of the Western World. It went on to become a gold-selling album.
Wow.
Quite a big hit at the time. The album was made for $40,000, which, back in those days it wasn't over-expensive, but it wasn't cheap either for us. And the Lord brought people around that project beyond anyone's ability. I think there are a couple of themes that I picked up later in life that if you're in the purposes of God, you'll be in the power of God. And so when you're in the flow, things start to happen. And if things aren't happening, you sometimes have to sort of say, okay, maybe I shouldn't tempt God or preempt something. Just wait for the leading. There's a time to step out in faith, and there's a time that you can see things aren't quite working. Maybe I need to take a step back and just put it before the Lord. But once we were in the flow, the Lord just brought people around us. What happened is that we needed to put a band together, a group to record the album, and one person had a contact with a guy called B. Birtles, and B. Birtle was the left-hand guitarist for Little River Band.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in those times, in the late 70s, early 80s, most of Australia's leading music artists in the secular world, quite a few of them became Christians. And when they became Christians, they left the music industry thinking that it was of the devil, and they didn't quite understand how to place their talent, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So they went into what I called the wilderness. These are my words. They were all in the wilderness, so at least for 5 years. So B. Birtles comes out of the wilderness, meets Steve. We went to his house down in Malvern, beautiful house. And basically, B. Birtles went on to produce the album, Children of the Western World. Okay. And from B. Birtles, he brought in all these other talents. He brought in David Moyes from Air Supply.
Oh, wow.
David was the lead guitarist for Air Supply. He also was in the wilderness a little bit, as I understood it. And he came out to come around what we called the Steve Grace Band. And then B. brought in George McCardle, which was the bass guitarist from LRB. And then there was a drummer from Perth. I can't remember his name right now, but all these guys were at the top of their game. And the drummer had just won Best Drummer of the Year in the Australian music industry. And then B. Birtles brought in John Farnham's backup singers. We went to Metropolis in South Melbourne, did the final mix. We went to Sing Sing in Richmond with Joe Camilleri to record the album, but did the final mix down at Metropolis where Farnham does his album in Studio 3. It was an amazing journey. Yeah. And so we had this inaugural Australian Christian album with a unique Australian person called Steve Grace that could write the words. He was a poet, but he was also a composer. And he was pretty much, as you can imagine, folk singers and so on. He had this blend of country rock, I suppose, in some of his music and what have you. But Children of the Western World, was a great success. Had a bit of a LRB feel to it because of Beeb's influence, like a high production sort of feel to it. And the rest is sort of, Christian history, I suppose.
We believe in you. We will follow you with our big dreams for little people.
You're listening to The Story. Today, Eric Scatterbo is once again chatting with Phil Fusco. As we just heard, Phil was Christian singer Steve Grace's first official manager and played a huge role in helping expose Steve to a larger audience. Also, it was at the time that Steve Grace made his highly successful debut album, Children of the Western World, which has since gone gold, making Steve Grace one of the most successful Australian Christian recording artists of all time. Next, we'll hear more of Phil's story as his life goes in a completely new direction. All that and more is coming up when we return.
The Story